Before we begin the episode, I would like to thank our sponsor, Accredited, an athlete wellness and performance monitoring system. Accredited allows players to share their training load, training intensity and highlight issues away from sport, empowering management to help players in a safe, secure and private manner. Players input their performance and wellness data on an easy-to-use mobile app. Accredited is an affordable monitoring system at less than €50 a month and is currently used by county and All-Ireland champions and over 50 soccer academies worldwide. For more information, please visit accredited.com for more. Welcome back to the Sideline Live podcast. You can follow us over on Twitter and Instagram at the Sideline Live. We'd love to hear from you. On episode 89, I'm delighted to be joined by Olympian and accredited sport and performance psychologist Jessie Barr. This is one of my favourite interviews to date, and Jessie is someone I wanted to speak to for a very long time. We discuss all things sports psychology, acceptance, outcome praising, lessons from her career and so much more. Hi Jessie, thanks a million for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Orla.
Before we get into everything, would you mind giving a quick elevator pitch to those who might not know who you are?
Yeah, of course. So my name is Jessie Barr. I am a sports psychologist at the Sport Ireland Institute in Dublin. So I work with Olympic athletes there, or Olympic aspiring athletes. And I am studying a PhD, as we talked about just before the recording started, for a very, very long time, in sports psychology, which hopefully will be done by this year. I'm looking specifically at athlete mental health as part of that research. And in a former life, I was an athlete myself. I competed in the 400 metre hurdles and as part of the 4x400 metre relay team at the London Olympics. So, yeah,
brilliant.
And it's me in a nutshell. We're out of lift, are we?
Before we get into everything, I suppose International Women's Day was yesterday. So in honour of that, who was your role model growing up? Were there any female athletes that you looked up to, or even non-athletes?
Yeah, I suppose like from female athletes, I mean, not that you're saying this is the obvious answer, but I mean, Sonia, you can't deny it. Like, I was of the era when we were in primary school and the TV was rolled in, and when I think she was running in the games in '96, which it would have been Atlanta, because it was definitely not 2000. I was younger than that. I remember being quite young, or it could have been when she was in Sydney. I can't remember, but I remember the TV being rolled in, and everyone knew Sonia O'Sullivan. Like, before you knew, even if you weren't interested in sport, people knew what she was doing. She was breaking barriers, not just for Irish women or Irish sportswomen, but sports people in general from Ireland. So I think she's just a fantastic role model, and she continues to be for the sport. So I think she definitely, growing up, was, when I wasn't super interested in sports, she definitely was someone who I would have looked up to.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned hurdles there. Running at very fast pace is one thing, but running, then trying to jump over hurdle is another thing. Why did you get involved in hurdles? And I think you mentioned before how it's a very tough event, so why did you pick that one?
Funny, the nickname for the 400 metre hurdles is literally the man killer. And I will argue with anyone from any other event in athletics that 400 metre hurdles is definitely one of the hardest events physically and mentally, I think, as well. And why I got into it was because I tried everything else and I wasn't as good. Simply, literally, process of elimination. I wasn't fast enough to be a sprinter. I couldn't jump high enough to be a jumper. Didn't have the endurance. I kind of had a little bit of everything, and it just seemed to be 400 hurdles that became my thing.
Brilliant. Random, but brilliant, yeah.
I know.
And during your career, what was the biggest motivator for you? Obviously, when you're younger, you enjoy sport, and I've heard you speak about before, it's so fun, but you made it into your career. What was the biggest motivator for you during those tough sessions where you didn't want to go training, or during those tough runs when you're finishing out a race and your legs are burning, your lungs are screaming?
I suppose the biggest motivator was always, as I got that bit older, it was the goal, is what I wanted to achieve. And I had the Irish record was always in the back of my head as something I want to achieve. When I got to London, it was Rio. There was always that goal, and that was that big dream goal. It was in the distance, but it was something, like you said, that sustained me. It wasn't, and obviously the short-term goals of what was coming up every season, but for me, it was always knowing what potential that I had. And, I hear the word potential thrown around a lot, but I know I was someone who had a lot of potential that even when I retired, didn't ever really get to realize it because I had a lot of injuries. But it was knowing what I thought I was capable of, and really wanting to see what that was. So I think that was what motivated. And then having things like Rio and breaking Irish records being, where that potential could be seen. Yeah, so they were what motivated me, definitely.
You mentioned before, I was really interested in this, but you've never seen a sports psychologist as an athlete. So at
Yeah.
what point in your career did you start pursuing this, and why?
So I never saw a sports psychologist because I thought I knew better. I studied psychology as an undergrad in UL. And the reason I went down the sports psychology route is because I was in a class that, they were very, very academic. It wasn't sporty. Like psychology and sports didn't really mix. A lot of people in sports psychology tend to come more from the PE and sports science kind of side. So it kind of made sense that like I was marrying my two biggest interests of psychology and sport. And when we were in our final year in undergrad, we had a guidance counselor come in, and she kind of asked everybody what is it that you guys are all thinking of doing? Because obviously you don't come from an undergrad straight into a job as a psychologist. There is lots of further training. And I would say out of the 27 of us, at least 20 said they wanted to do clinical, and they were basically laughed at because clinical psychology is notoriously hard to get into, probably one of the hardest courses to get into as a postgrad. So, when I said sports psychology, she was actually really interested and said, wow, that's a growing field. And it really did give me that encouragement that like I'm pursuing the right thing. It was still quite new. There wasn't many of them, but I knew it was something that I had a niche. So, and then when like, I never thought I needed a sports psychologist until I got a bit older and I was hit with injuries and setbacks. And my mom, bless her, used to encourage me, please go and see someone, please go and see someone. But when I was doing my master's, I took a year out after my undergrad and then went on and did a 2-year master's. And I was saying, Mom, I don't need to. I know what they're going to tell me. That's like a doctor saying, I don't need to go to the doctor. I know what they're going to prescribe me. It's not the same thing. You need that support. But I was stubborn, thought I knew better, thought I was going to be rolling my eyes going, I know what you're going to tell me here. And it was very naive of me. It's something that I really do regret because, okay, would it have stopped me getting injured? No, but it probably would have helped me cope better with injuries, with the setbacks, even with the big occasions. The days I still loved. I loved the big occasions. I loved the big races, but it might have just helped me even better than I could have been. So it is always a regret I have, and it's something I'm very passionate about now to encourage younger athletes. I work with a lot of development athletes, and I'm really glad because I see the value that it can have all throughout the career, not when things are going wrong. So yeah, still never sat in a psychology session other than post Olympics when we just had as part of like the transition program, which kind of started then. I had a 1-to-1 who ended up being my PhD supervisor, and we still laugh about it. Yeah, but that was it. That was my only exposure, which is kind of mad to think that's what my career became.
Okay, that's mad. Yeah. And at what point do you think athletes should start seeing a sports psychologist? Obviously, every athlete's different, every journey's different, injuries, different challenges, obstacles. But is there a certain age or even just a certain amount of experience that you think that this is kind of, that kind of, where the stars align into this one point where this is really kind of where people should start?
I don't think there's any certain age. Like I work with, I think one of the youngest athletes I've worked with was maybe 13 or 14. But I suppose it depends on maturity. You want to have someone, if they're that young, they probably have to have a certain level of maturity to take it on board. So, athletes at that level are probably involved in something like swimming or gymnastics, which you're already performing at a high level at quite a young age compared to something, other sports that, at 13, it's very much still for participation. So I think it depends on the sport. I think it depends on the person and their level of interest. The worst thing that I could say is having a parent bringing an athlete who doesn't want to do it come to me. Then it doesn't matter what age they are. So it needs to come from them. It needs to be driven by them or have an interest at least. So yeah, there's no set age range. There really isn't. Like I think teenagers, it's never too early to start and just develop mental skills. Develop some coping strategies that when it comes to the more senior age groups, when they are coming to bigger pressure and more, riding on their performances, they already have those coping strategies when they're younger. So we're developing more specific ones to what their needs are. So, basic mental skills around goal setting, relaxation, they can be done at any age. But I think the biggest thing is the buy-in and the maturity for the athlete to actually understand and be able to come away from a session and be like, understanding how to apply it. So, yeah, I think teenage years for sure.
Okay,
it just depends on, like I said, on the athlete.
Yeah, you mentioned even your mindset there. and I think I've spoken to a lot of athletes, and
Mm.
recently with Brian Gregan, and he said a friend of his gave him great advice and celebrate every PB as if it's your last. And you mentioned it there, kind of when you're moving from one goal to the next. How do you balance that goal setting, that drive, that motivation, but still, and it's probably hard to do in the middle of your career, but kind of reflect on what you've done and what you've accomplished?
Yeah, and look, I really agree. And I know obviously Brian has had a real resurgence in his career recently, which is brilliant to see. But yeah, I think you just never know when your last PB is going to be your last. You never know your last race is going to be your last. Like I ran my PB in 2012 and I didn't retire until 2018. If you had told me that was going to be my PB for the rest of my career, I would have laughed. So I think, yeah, celebrate your successes. You don't like, I think you can still be driving towards the next thing and you can still be motivated, but taking a step back for a couple of days and being like, all that work culminated in this, isn't that brilliant? You know, it doesn't mean that you've stopped. You know, there isn't, this has to be this constant drive for the next, because where does that stop? You know, where is the finish? Where is the end goal? And who, you know, if you win 10 Olympic gold medals, you want the 11th, you know, so where does it end? When can you actually just say, I'm pretty happy with that, you know? And and I think I remember hearing you ask someone about, what they see as success. And I think success for everyone is, setting a goal, working towards it and achieving it. And whatever that is, if it's qualifying for a county final in athletics, which is not a county final in GAA terms, is much lower, if that's your goal, or if winning an Olympic medal, it's what you decided is your, whatever your goal is. If it's just to run a personal best, if it's to be able to finish a 10K, that's success if you set out to achieve that. So I think it's really important to, if you set a goal, reflect on it and enjoy it, and then say, okay, well, now what's next? I'm excited, rather than kind of going, great, okay, head down again, back to it. I really enjoyed when I got to the Olympics because it was an amazing achievement, but it really motivated me to do it again. I want to feel this feeling again. I want to enjoy this feeling of achieving this goal more and more. So it can be really motivating.
Yeah, there's a great podcast with Mel Marshall, Adam Peaty, swimming coach, and she was saying throughout her coaching career, all she did was she wanted to get the kids to their Olympics. And for 3 of them, it was the Olympics, but for the other, how many there were, it was that county final, that national final. Even if they didn't win, that was their Olympics. So it's trying to remember that as an athlete and as a coach, because we get caught up in this comparison race all the time. And I play GAA in basketball and I'm constantly comparing to other athletes. How do you develop that tunnel vision? And I asked Sophie Becker about this because I guess in individual sport, you're just yourself, whereas when I'm in a team environment, there's so much opportunity to compare. How do you develop that individual kind of tunnel vision mindset?
You know what? I actually don't try to develop tunnel vision. I think it's more about acceptance, accepting that these people have certain skills. I also have certain skills, and a lot of work I would do with athletes is kind of strength-based. Instead of always being like, look what they have, I don't have that. But what do I have? What am I bringing to the table? I'm on this team too. What are my skill sets? Do I need to have the skill sets? She's a forward, I'm a back. Do I need to be able to do what she does? No, but I can do this and she can't, So even when, like you said, Sophie in athletics, you could have 6 people lining up in this 400-meter indoors that the girls can be running at the World Indoors. They'll all have different skill sets. Some of them will be really, some will be a really good sprinter and will use that strength at the start of the race. That doesn't mean they're guaranteed to beat the person who's a better, in the last 100 meters. So you skills that you have and the strength. So a lot of work I do with athletes is to kind of acknowledge and accept that you can't control that you are different to other athletes, but accepting and starting to acknowledge that what am I good at? What are my skills? So rather than it being trying to tunnel vision, because like that, it's like the pink elephant theory. I tell you to think about a pink elephant. It's the only thing you're going to think about. Even if I tell you not, stop thinking about it now, it's all this in your head. So if you try to put it to, tunnel vision or blinkers, all you're doing is actually drawing essentially more attention to what's beyond that. But why do I have to put these up there? Because I'm trying to avoid something. Instead of just being like, it is what it is. These people have different skills, but what do I have? And bring it back to me again. And that's what I try to encourage with athletes.
That's
easier.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
Easier but harder.
It definitely is hard. And I think it was similar with, I had a clip with Nadia Pear. I think she mentioned you saying that last year, before she ran her one of her races earlier in the year, she did an exercise with you where she took a sheet of paper and she wrote down all the reasons why she could get that specific time, that PB. I think it was the Irish record, but it's now no longer the Irish record.
Yeah.
But it's that strength exercise. How often do you do that with athletes?
Pretty regularly. And I do that with everyone. It's such a simple exercise. I call it evidence gathering. I call it usually evidence gathering because, like, you know, at the end of the day, psychology is a science and you want to gather the evidence to prove why. So say like being confident going into a race. How can I be confident that I'm capable of doing what I'm setting out to do? Where is the evidence? Rather than saying in 6 months, I'm going to be stronger because I'm doing this new gym program. That's no good to you when you're starting on the start line today. Where's the evidence on everything that you've done so far that you can be confident standing on that start line? So you're kind of eliminating the noise that might be taking away from your confidence and adding. And it's hard, you know, and athletes are, you know, it's not normal, and it's definitely not a comfortable place for Irish athletes because we are modest in our nature. So to say, and there's a worry, and I've had athletes kind of saying, oh, but does it seem like I'm a bit full of myself? And I'm like, well, sure, who's going to read it? You're only one reading it. I'm not even going to read. I don't have to read it. You can do this in your own time. This is just for you to have written down proof somewhere that when on the day, the stress, the nerves, the panic becomes, you know, starts to override the logical thinking, you have something written somewhere in your phone or on a bit of paper that reminds you, okay, I know I'm nervous and I know I'm dreading this, but here's all the reasons why I can still have a bit of confidence in what I want to execute. And bringing it back to that logical place. You know, it's not that you're trying to say, oh, I'm brilliant and I'm going to beat everybody. If you don't have proof of that, you're just, you know, you can be kind of, it's hard to buy into that, but you kind of say, okay, I don't know what these girls are capable of, but I know what I'm capable of, and this is what I'm planning to do. So it's really, I do that with athletes, you know, regularly enough. Obviously not every single time I meet them, but there has, you know, with enough time that's passed that they can be adding to it and maybe going back and reminding them, like, go and revisit that. If it's something, you know, I feel like going into a competition the next morning, revisit that list. Is there anything else you can add since we last spoke? You know, it's really simple exercise, but it can be really powerful.
Do you find it beneficial to draw on your own experience as an athlete, or do you try separate that from your clients? How do you balance that?
Yeah, no, I find it beneficial. You know, I try, but I also have to be very aware that my experience is one person. You know, my experience is one perspective. So it's great in terms of building a rapport with an athlete because straight away they know you know what I'm talking about. You know, you can not, I'm not sympathizing with an athlete, I'm empathizing when they're talking about a really difficult situation because I probably have been there or understand it. So I think it's really great for building that early rapport, that building that relationship and building that trust, because I'm not just talking about something that I've read. You know, I've lived it, and I think that can be really valuable for an athlete to kind of get that buy-in straight away. And I kind of say, look, this is my experience. I don't know if this is something that you can, you know, I never say, well, this is what I experienced, so that must be what you're feeling. I kind of say, well, this is actually, I was in a situation like that and I felt like this. Is this something like, you know, try to use it to try and understand there. And then they can either tell me, no, that's not how I feel, or yeah, actually, this is how I feel. You know, sometimes if they're struggling to kind of verbalize what it is they're experiencing, I can say, God, I think I was in a similar situation, or actually I trained with someone who experienced something like that. Is that kind of what you're getting at? Is this how it's made you feel? So it's really good to, you know, I suppose develop the conversation and get that trust. But it doesn't mean if you're a sports psychologist, you have to have been an elite athlete or an athlete at all, but it definitely has been really beneficial for me.
Brilliant. You're a pro. That was actually my next question. But what's it like moving from being an athlete to being the support staff, watching your athletes compete?
I won't lie, at first it was really hard because when I actually retired officially in 2018, but I didn't really tell anyone. I was, because I kind of fallen off the radar in terms of athletics anyway. So I was kind of happy to just continue to fade into obscurity and then become a sports psychologist. And that's kind of what happened. And then in 2019, I was involved in just some work with Irish Life Health. And of course, the interview turned to your injuries and what are you going to do? Are you aiming for Tokyo? Already, even though I knew I'd already retired. I was okay, I probably have to say it. So suddenly it became in 2019 this big like retirement announcement as part of the Irish Life Health whatever campaign was going on. And I was like, this is not what I intended. I wanted to just fade away. And people who knew me knew I was done. And that article, actually, the articles kind of relates that came out when I was away at the European Games as part of my first team, as the first time traveling with an Irish team as sports psychologist. So I was on a team with people who 2 or 3 years ago I probably would have been on the same team as. There's an athletics team there, and some of them were my former teammates. So I found that transition quite difficult, but it was probably exactly what I needed. That I was there in a different role. I had already been working in the institute for 2 years, and that one was probably quite a big jump because I jumped straight into, like, I went to the European Youth Olympics later that summer, and that was fine because I was never going to be, these are all 16-year-olds. It was very different, but suddenly I was around people who I could have been on this team, I could have been with them. So I found that quite challenging, but I just separated myself from it. I made a really conscious decision. Like, there was one or two people on the team I would have been very good friends with, and I made a conscious decision. I kind of told them, I'm not going to be sitting with you guys for meals. I'm going to be sitting with the staff. I'm creating that separation, and that's what I continued to do, and I needed to do that. And now I'm a few years on, and it's fine. And I really love what I do, and I'm really invested in the athletes I work with. Like, you could ask Paul when any of them are competing, like, I'm on Twitter refreshing or trying to get live streams, and I finally understand like how coaches and parents feel, because I feel so invested, even with people I've met once or twice for sessions. And then there's people who I have a more sustained relationship with for a few years who I'm really nervous for and really feel for. So I love it. I love what I do, and I love when, I can see, maybe I can see them maybe doing breathing exercises before. I'm like, yes, they're doing it. Or, if they come back to me and say that thing that we worked on, it really helped. It just feels so good to get that. So I really love what I do now, but the transition definitely it was more challenging than I anticipated. But I suppose it was just, I did it so quickly. It went from one to the other. But no, I have no regrets now, and I love it. And I love getting to travel with teams, and there's such a sense of pride. And I was listening to Damien Hughes's interview with you, and it's the relationship you develop with people. That's where the kind of the joy from this kind of job comes from, and being able to see them, any bit of help that you've given them, if that helps their performance, that feels so good.
Absolutely. Identity is an interesting topic, I think, particularly with athletes. And your brother had a really good Instagram post, and I think he took a screenshot of that article, and it said former Olympian. He crossed it out and said once an Olympian, always an Olympian. And how did you find that piece of retiring, and how do you help athletes go through that? Because you've done this for so long, and it was your life. So how do you deal with then becoming, a smaller part, even though you're still involved in sport, but you're not actually competing?
Hard, really hard. Like, I'm not going to lie, it was really, really hard. And it's probably one of the hardest things because, I started athletics at 11 and I retired just before my 30th birthday. So it was the biggest, it was my whole adult life until then and most of my life was being an athlete. So it became who I identified myself as. I was Jessie the athlete, I was Jessie the 400 hurdler, but also people saw me as that. So like when I met people, the first question was, how's training going? When's your next race? Or are you still injured? Which was the one that really drove me mad, because my identity became not just the athlete, but the injured athlete. Are you injured? Are you rehabbing? When will you be back racing? Oh God. But that was who I was. And when that was taken away, I was like, oh my God, what do I have to talk about anymore? Who am I without athletics? And I was very fortunate that I did transition so quickly into being a sports psychologist. So I had that transition, and it's something I'm working with a few athletes now who are going through that transition. And in the Sport Ireland Institute, we have a fantastic transition program that has come into effect as of last year to support athletes, in that gradual transition, because it can feel very final. Like, even only yesterday, I was in the institute and I met an athlete who has recently retired using the gym. And the purpose of the transition program is you don't suddenly one day go from being an athlete with all access to all these supports, access to the institute, having all of this structure, and then the next day all that's gone. And that's the way it has been. So, you can still come to the gym, you have access for, I think, 6 months up to maybe even a year. I'm not sure exactly, depending how long they've been on, supports and carding. But, suddenly all those people are not suddenly removed from their lives. All that structure doesn't have to be removed, and some people want to move away from that completely and they're done with that, but others need that time to kind of, graduate out of that, because for some people, the retirement can come quite quickly, and it's going. Last week I was competing in this competition, and this week I'm just a normal person again. What? So I found that really challenging. But I think having something, I always had study. I always was preparing the next career, whether I even realized it or not. I was preparing for that transition. So it's something we actively try to support athletes to do. It doesn't mean they have to give loads of time to it, but just be thinking, doing little courses, just thinking about what their interests are outside of the sport, so that their identity isn't just the athlete, but the athlete is part of that identity, and there's other things to them. So yeah, it is. It was something that was really hard, and I did struggle to come to terms with that. And it's something I still sometimes struggle with. I might sometimes watch a race, the 400-meter hurdles, and even though it's gone to a crazy, insane level this year, which I was never going to be part of, I still look and go, what could have been? And sometimes I kind of do, and I still have that athletic identity will never fully leave me. But it's definitely not the biggest part of me anymore, which it was for such a long time. So yeah, it is for any athlete, no matter how ready you are or not ready you are for retirement, it's a really challenging time. So I'm really glad that I suppose that I have that experience, and I understand how hard it is when I am supporting athletes. And I suppose being that former athlete, can be a help as well again.
There's a really interesting podcast with Paul McGinley, and they were talking about athletes and kind of plan A and plan B, and you mentioned there kind of about retirement and always kind of having not a plan B, but just kind of an idea of what you want to do. Yeah. And he was talking to a golf coach in America, I think it was University of Minnesota, and the golf coach was saying, well, I want an athlete that it's only golf, that's my only plan, I don't even have a plan B. Whereas Paul was saying he had a plan B for his career, and if he found that as a release. What do you think is more effective from what you've seen, or even on your own experience? Is it better to only have one plan where it's athletics or nothing, or is it better to have athletics and then you have the sports psychology or other elements as well?
I'm definitely going to say the latter. The plan B is really important. And I think it's kind of an old school mentality in a lot of sports that, like, if you're not giving 100% to your sport, you're not giving 100% to being an athlete. And by doing something else, it's not that you're not taking away. No athlete trains 24/7, 7 days a week. There is other time in the day. And obviously, even when you're recovering, you can be on the laptop doing a little bit of work. It doesn't have to be anything too draining. But I think, there's research to say it. We have a whole life skills department in the institute, the psychology department. We would all agree that it's a much healthier way to be, because it takes the stress off. It is something that as athletes get older, they are starting to think about it naturally, because they know their careers coming to an end. Talk to an 18-year-old athlete, they don't think like that. But talk to a 28-year-old, 32-year-old athlete, they are thinking like that. And if they haven't been considering it, it becomes a stress that can actually essentially take away from their performance. So just having a plan B, doesn't have to be actions yet, but just having that safety net, I think, is really important, because, if you don't, everyone is only one injury away from a career being over, one drop from a team, from their career changing significantly. So yeah, I think it's always the healthier way. And it's just to get that point across, that if you're doing something else outside of the sport, it doesn't mean you're not giving 100% to your sport. It just, they're two separate things. It doesn't have to be that you're taking from one to give to the other. There is space for both in your life, and it's just about being able to figure out what time constraints you have, what your structure looks like, and working around your timetable, rather than trying to. And this is where sometimes people can go wrong. They try to do too much, and that's where coaches can get frustrated. So we have a brilliant life skills department, led by Owen Reinish, who's a former Olympian as well. And, they will sit with athletes and plan their week and plan their days and see what will work around their training, rather than vice versa. They're not pushing to have a career first and then sport. They're seeing, how can we supplement your sport with something else, so that you don't have no plan B.
How do you help the athletes that dream of the Olympics, dream of Tokyo, Paris, that fall short and don't make it, or sustain a career-ending injury, or even in other sports like GA is a great example for, the 35 players that are on the panel. There's probably maybe 200 that have put in the same work but just don't get the opportunity, and they actually might be a better player. It's just the opportunity isn't there. How do you help them deal with that and cope with that feeling of, just not achieving, what you've always dreamt from a very young age?
Yeah, it's really hard. And I think, I would have athletes who are scared to set goals that high to self-protect. They're kind of trying to self-preserve and say, Olympics might be thrown around, but they're scared to set it as a goal because they say, well, what if it doesn't happen? And I'm like, well, it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. But if you don't set a goal and make a plan towards it, it's less likely to happen. So, it's about sometimes challenging an athlete and their belief around that and it's an uncomfortable conversation to have, kind of saying, well, you can decide not to set this goal and live in a comfort. That's fine. I'm happy to support that. But if you deep down have a goal, you know, you have to understand that it may not happen. Goals just because you decide you want to do something, it doesn't happen that way. And sports is probably one of the cruelest arenas and environments for that. But just because you are the hardest worker, it doesn't mean. And I think this is something that young athletes have to understand. I think there's this idea that in sport, if you are the hardest worker, you're going to get the most rewards. And unfortunately, that is not the case. You can be unlucky. There can be someone who just has more natural raw talent than you, or you may not have the same resources as someone else. So it doesn't necessarily mean that because you put in the work, you're going to get the rewards. And that's what's really unfair about sport. And it's probably one of the things I hate the most about sport and about the area I work in. And it's very cutthroat for that reason. And I think it's explaining that to athletes that like sport isn't fair. And if you wanted to go into something that was fair, you're in the wrong place. Just because you've done this doesn't mean this will happen. This will not be the result. And I use my own examples there. And, I worked for 4 years between London and Rio to get to Rio, and it didn't happen. But I didn't let go of that right until the deadline had passed and I had not qualified. So right up until then, there was always that glimmer of hope. And the whole world fell apart for me for a while when it didn't happen. But I don't regret having that goal in my mind that I was going to Rio, because there was times when I was injured, it was really hard, and it would have been easier to just say, just drop it, stop pushing, stop trying. But I wanted that. And if I hadn't set that goal, it was never going to happen. If I hadn't decided I want to go to Rio, I wouldn't have pushed as hard in the times that I did. And I wouldn't have maintained or sustained the training that I did do when I did do it. So yeah, I think it's about really getting athletes to kind of understand that setting a goal doesn't guarantee anything, but not setting a goal is also not going to do anything for you. So it's, about kind of getting them to really talk about what they really want. And if they are scared, I'm never going to push someone. I'm going to support them for what they want. But like, if and you can get a sense from someone if they are holding back or scared to set a goal, I'll encourage and kind of create that safe space that say, if there is disappointments after us, we'll deal with that. But there's no point in thinking about the disappointments that haven't happened yet. And people think ahead to think, well, but what if it doesn't happen? I'm like, well, it mightn't. That's fine, but it might. And then wouldn't that be great if it did, So why are we stressing about something that hasn't happened yet? And, kind of this self-fulfilling prophecy, you're already thinking about what might not happen and putting in place steps to make sure it doesn't, rather than putting in place the steps that it does. So it can be a difficult conversation. But it is learning to live with that discomfort and that uncertainty and just controlling what they can be certain of.
Exactly. You had a fantastic webinar on YouTube. I can't remember. I think it was definitely over COVID. I can't remember who it was with, but you mentioned goal setting. You mentioned goal setting, and you broke it into 3 interesting parts. And I hadn't heard of this before, but I really like it. And it was about the process goals, the performance goals, and the outcome goals. And I found that really interesting. Can you explain that to the listeners who aren't sure about this technique?
Yeah. So I suppose the easiest way, like performance goals in every setting, but so rather than we think of goal setting, we think of long-term, medium-term, short-term. And that's great. But from a sports psychology perspective, I like to think of them in terms of outcome, performance, process. So if you think of your outcome goal, it might be qualifying for the Olympics, winning championship, qualifying for this, setting a PB. They're all outcomes. They're all the outcome of the processes that happen along the way. So the performance goals tend to be in something, they're not as always clear cut. So say in something like athletics, it might be the performance goal might be, say in the 40-meter hurdles, doing a certain amount of steps in between the hurdles, or maybe for swimming, it's the stroke count that they get. So there's very measurable, but they're also performance goals. So I'll just kind of, because I think performance goals get confusing for people, so I just park that one. Process and outcome are probably the easiest way to think about it. So your outcome goals are the outcome. But what's most important, because they're not in your control right now. I'm sitting here and I want to finish my PhD. That's the outcome. That's great. But what are the steps that I'm going to take to make that happen? They're the process goals. So they're the controllable steps that you take day in, day out, to make sure that outcome actually happens. And the performance goals then could be little performance indicators. You've probably heard of KPIs, key performance indicators along the way. So, it could be, okay, a performance goal for me might be submitting a chapter to my supervisors to read. The process goal could be, writing 500 words every day. So it's like an achievable thing that leads to a performance that eventually leads to an overall outcome. And I like to break that down. I do that with athletes because, often they, you ask an athlete what they want to do, what do they want to achieve, what is their goal? And I say, okay, well, how are you going to do it? The what is great, but how? What are the steps? What are the plans? What are the actions? And it's just breaking it down really simply and making it something that's achievable, every single day. And then you can have your short-term process goals, your medium-term process goals, your long-term, that all lead to that outcome, which is like the top of the ladder, the top of the pyramid. And it's a really simple process in terms of goal setting, but it's something we overlook. Is like, what's the plan? Okay, like, for example, last night I met with a GA team, and a lot of it came back to, well, what are the actions? We talk about, well, we want to develop a culture, for example. And okay, well, how are we going to measure that? What are the steps that we're going to take towards building this culture? What will that look like? What are the steps? What are the action plans? And think of SMART goal setting. Are they specific enough? How can we measure it? Because otherwise we have all these lofty kind of vague ideas, but we don't have an actual very clear plan of action to do it. So that's what the process is that those little steps, those little plans of action that you put in place for that outcome to be more achievable.
Mm-hmm. I have a number of coaches and probably parents listening as well. And you mentioned before about the language and what you praise. And instead of praising the outcome and, winning this race, will you praise the fact you trained 5 times this week, you still got all your homework done, you did really well in your exam, and you still got out to go with your friends.
Yeah.
That seems to be really important. That I think I'm a GA coach, so I've now shifted my mindset. Instead of, obviously I'll still compliment and give encouragement to a player, but I actually now am going to praise their process, their work, rather than they scored 7-5 in a match or something ridiculous like that.
Yeah. 100%. And like, you've probably heard of things like, the growth mindset. You're praising the effort rather than praising the outcome, because the outcome's not in your control. Okay, like you said, they scored 7 points today, then they feel really good. So if they only scored 3 points the next time, does that mean they're not as good anymore? So if you're only praising the outcome, if that outcome doesn't always happen, does that mean they're not as motivated or they're losing confidence? So if you're always praising the effort, the hard work, what went into scoring that, oh, you did brilliant today. You worked so hard on improving your goal kicking, and then you scored a goal today. And that, and it really shows the hard work paid off. Or you worked really hard with the rest of the team, and you've been, you've turned up at training, you've turned up early, you're always there on time, praising all those processes, because that's what, an athlete can control. At the end of the day, the outcome can't be controlled, and it's not always it's not always an athlete's fault if the outcome doesn't work out the way they'd hoped. But, the controllable things are not necessarily their fault, but they are in their control. So yeah, praising that so that growth mindset kind of idea, rather than it being the fixed mindset. And this idea of the growth mindset is that things are in my control. I can improve, I can get better at something. Just because I'm bad at maths now, it doesn't mean I'm bad at maths forever. Whereas the fixed mindset is like, talent is fixed. I'm either a good athlete or I'm not. I'm fast or I'm not. I'm better than everyone or I'm not. And hard work doesn't really matter. It's all about talent. And, which is going to be able to sustain an athlete more long term? Is it being told you're really talented, or is it being told that hard work can make you better? So I think it's really important. And I think it's really important for parents as well to consider is what are they actually supporting? And my parents we're very, very lucky. My parents always supported us to enjoy it. Like, that was number one. If you're enjoying it, we'll support it. If you're not, okay, we'll look at it and see why you're not enjoying it. And if medals happened or good performances happened, it was a bonus, because it didn't happen so much when we were younger. So it very much was praising the effort and the hard work, because there was a lot more hard work and there were rewards when we were younger. And I think, but that's why we were in it for so long, because we weren't in it for the rewards. They were the bonus.
Yeah, and I think Damien Hughes might have mentioned that, but there's loads of studies behind this. It's the ones that maybe peak at 12 or 13 aren't the ones that are going to still actually be in the sport by 22 or 23. And there's a really good phrase, I can't remember where I found it, but it was like talent is a muscle. I thought that was really important. This can be stretched, it can be strengthened, it can be molded. It's not just this fixed talent that somebody has.
Yeah.
I think language is really important as a coach, but I think I'm starting to find I still play, so as a player and an athlete, it's even more important, because I would find my internal dialogue be very, very negative. How do you develop that language? And I heard you say before, instead of positive language, because when you're in the last 10 seconds of a race and you want to stop, it's not going to be, keep going. It's that, I think you said productive language.
Yeah. No, you're 100% right. And look, we all tend to have more of us probably have a more negative dialogue than positive. Like, it is more natural to be more negative than positive and have this negativity bias, that we are more likely to notice the negatives and pay attention to the negatives. And so I think, it's about reframing that language. And like, exercise I would do with an athlete is get them to write down what are those things that they're hearing themselves say to themselves again and again. There's certain self-talk that might become quite frequent, or maybe it might relate to certain, might be a training session or a race. There's certain things you're saying, that internal dialogue, or that you're thinking to yourself. Writing it down and seeing, how can I make this more helpful, more productive? Because, there is this, and I think we're kind of starting to become really familiar with this idea of toxic positivity, because there isn't always a place for positive thinking. Positive thinking is really important where it's relevant. But like that, if you're absolutely wrecked, you've just swam 700 of an 800 meter freestyle race, you're probably not thinking, I'm fine, this feels great. When your arms and legs are burning, your lungs are on fire, you need to be realistic. And sometimes, and some people respond to that kind of overly positive thinking, and that's great. And I learned to recognize that in athletes pretty quick. But it's more about being realistic. Say, okay, my lungs are burning, that acceptance thing that I talked about earlier. My lungs are burning, my legs are on fire, but I'm always in this situation. It's how I'm meant to feel at 700 meters into an 800 meter race. I'm meant to feel like this, but I've trained to be ready for it. So having little kind of, self-talk cues for when those thoughts might come in. How can I reframe it? Instead of it being, oh my God, I'm dying, I'm never going to finish. It's like, but you're not meant to feel fresh now. You feel like this in every race, but you've trained to be able to keep going. Trust the training, trust the process, trust what you've done. And we'll talk about this and have little kind of, so there might be a little self-talk cue, little motivating kind of words at that point to maybe draw their attention somewhere else. So if all the attention is on how they're physically feeling, maybe to draw their attention away to just a technical cue, just head down, fast arms, for example, or it could be something external, keeping an eye on where the other competitors are if you need that motivation to keep going. So, being able to control your attention using, self-talk, reframing the self-talk. So changing it, like, one big thing you see in self-talk is the kind of, I should, I need to, I have to, and I'll always challenge that kind of pressure language. Okay, well, I should win this because I've always beaten these girls, so I should win this today, or I have to win this, I have to run this time to qualify for X competition. And I'm like, okay, who's telling you have to? Where is it you have to? You want to, and switch the language. It's the same thing, but there's not as much pressure with I want to, or I can, because of, and again, go back to that evidence we talked about. I can run this time. I want to run this time today, and I can because I've done this, this, and this, and this is the evidence to say I can. And it takes that pressure off the, I have to do it. Because, telling yourself you have to do something, straight away there's a tension, there's a stress on your body, whereas, I can. Okay, it's still pressure, but it's different pressure. And so, it's just about reframing, recognizing, first of all, just become aware, recognize that self-talk, that dialogue, and see, how can I make this work better for me? How can I actually reframe the language? How can I change this? And a really good exercise to do is, what would I say to someone else if they were saying that back to me? If your training partner, your friend, or whoever was saying, oh my God, it's the biggest race in my life, I have to win it, or everyone's going to think I'm so, I'm useless, to say, no, you don't have to win it. You can win it. You're probably going to. And these are the reasons why, because you're the best in there. You've beaten everyone in this race before. You've trained the best you've ever trained. Just go in and do what you know how to do. That's what you tell someone else. Why don't we tell that to ourselves, you know?
Exactly. And that's actually something that came up recently with our team, and it was, and I've taken it for myself. It's
Hmm.
if that voice inside your head, if you said that to your best friend, and if they didn't like what you were saying, like, why would you say it? And I think sometimes if I said what's in my head to my best friend, I don't think we'd be friends anymore.
I
But
know.
it's trying to remember just to reframe and like use those trigger points. Like even mentioned, head down, fast hands. Or I think that's what you said, but it's
Hmm.
just those little triggers to use, and that language is. I think we really overlook it maybe as
Yeah.
athletes. That language, what you're thinking, eventually it's gonna, if you're thinking that over and over and over, eventually that's probably going to impact your training at some point.
Yeah. Like the person that you listen to the most is yourself. So why are you feeding yourself so much negativity? And look, practice what I preach, not always. I would have some very negative thoughts as well, but I'm much better for catching myself and being like, well, and why am I letting myself go down this? It's doing nothing for me. How's it making me feel? More negative. And sometimes you need to have that negativity. Sometimes you need to ride out the negative emotion and then replace it with something. But in the middle of a race is probably not the time to be feeling the emotion. So,
Exactly. Exactly.
yeah.
Sport is such an emotional roller coaster, and I remember after the Olympics, a lot of athletes kind of wrote articles or spoke out about their experience after the
Mm.
Olympics. What's it like going through that as an athlete, and when you're helping athletes going through? They say there's like the certain amount of stages that you go through where you've realized, and I've kind of mentioned it a few times on my podcast, where you go through your whole life training for this one event. It's about 3 weeks long, and then you realize that time keeps going and the Olympics are done. How do you deal with that?
I'm answering another question with it's hard, but it is. um, you know, I think like I've been working with some athletes in different sports who like were very vocal and very, they were very strong in their kind of messaging that like I've been working towards this for 20 years or this is what I've my lifelong dream. And when you build something up for that long or you put something on a pedestal that much, how often does it actually measure up to what you wanted? Unless you achieve the absolute top by, getting a personal best and a gold medal, you're probably going to be a little bit disappointed by some aspect. Like some people come away and are like, Olympics was even more amazing than I thought. But the people who built it up to be this amazing thing and my whole life will be different once I'm an Olympian are the ones who unfortunately are sorely disappointed and they learn that afterwards the hard way. Um, because the Olympics at the end of the day, there's a lot of fanfare, there's a lot of excitement, there's a lot of boredom. Even if you take away the performance, it's a boring 3 weeks. You do the same thing day in, day out. You've done the celeb spotting, that's great. And then it's now I'm just eating off a tray every single day in the same tiny box room. And it's not that the glamour is not what you see. What you see on screen is not what goes on behind the scenes. It's not a glamorous thing. And then the performance, it's just, I know it's the Olympics, but it's just another competition. It's the exact same as the World Championships. It's the exact same as the Europeans. The only difference is there's different people and there's more attention on it. So it's something we try to prepare athletes in the Institute for. So we've really ramped up our transition program and we have, we do workshops with athletes and we do a lot of, contingency planning with athletes beforehand. And I don't think some people, they obviously buy into it, but I don't think they realize how important that was until afterwards. They kind of going, yeah, that's great. But I don't think it's going to, and the workshops can seem quite negative before they go, especially if they haven't been to a game. They're going, why are they telling us about this Olympic blues? And why are they telling us that we're going to feel these ways? And it's like, because you might, but you kind of have to, you're kind of like, you can tell people so much, but until they've experienced it, they won't really get it. And not everyone has that experience, but it is quite a common experience to kind of come home and be like, okay, trained for 4 years for that. Now do I just train again for 4 years for the next one? What has changed? I have the tattoo, I have my performance, I'm an Olympian. So let's go back to training. I still have to just do
the same thing
normal
over
thing.
and over again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I actually had that when I came back from Rio. I took a bit of an extended break. And then I remember going back to training in UL, back in the same corner of the UL arena in the strip of track behind Richie's step aerobics class that I've been there for 5 years before we went out into the cold track. And I remember doing the same drills again. And I was just like, feel like the Groundhog Day. How am I back here? What? Nothing is different. I thought things were going to be different, and because when I didn't get to Rio, I was already disappointed. And then I was like, okay, am I going to just go back and do it all again for 4 years? So I ended up taking a bit of a longer break, and it's something we encourage athletes to have something ready for after the games that will take their mind off the games completely, whether it's a holiday, maybe starting a new course. Having some sort of change or something to look forward to is really important, because a lot of people try to continue their season afterwards and realize they're mentally just fried by the end of it. Even if it hasn't been a long season, it's a really challenging few weeks mentally and physically. So, yeah, and I think, the transition program has been really good to support athletes, but like that, we are even looking at how we can make it better for next time. We're learning every time, and there was, I don't know, you probably saw it, went around on Twitter, this athlete from New Zealand wrote kind of a letter to herself, some things she wished she had known. And, we had a lot of athletes sharing that, and we were saying, okay, maybe we need to use other athletes' voices better. A lot of the messaging beforehand was coming from sports psychologists and life skills. And even though two of us were former Olympians, it probably wasn't hitting because a lot of them wouldn't have known us. They probably needed someone who was a familiar face, maybe still involved, to kind of say, well, this is my experience after the Olympics, but I'm still competing and I'm still going, and this is what I did. So, we're always learning how to make that experience better for athletes, but it'll be always challenging no matter how many sports you put around. At the end of the day, they're going to feel what they feel. So, just preparing that, the Olympics is amazing, but it's not the only thing you'll ever do.
Mm-hmm. Pressure is a privilege is a phrase that's come up a lot in the podcast. What would be your take on that?
Yeah, I agree. Pressure is a perception. Pressure is something that you perceive. It's very much, it's from in terms of cognitive psychology, pressure is just something that you perceive. It's the same way as nerves are a perception. Nerves are just a physiological response to a situation, but they become nerves if you perceive them as nerves, or it's excitement if you perceive it as excitement. It feels the same. And pressure is like that. You can go into a competition and see it as a threat. Something that like the have tos, the shoulds, the need tos, and see it as something to be afraid of. Or you can go into a competition and see it as a challenge. And this is something I would do with athletes a lot, this kind of threat versus challenge mindset. Where pressure can be a negative is if you see all the negatives that could happen as a result of the outcome. Oh my God, I'm under so much pressure, and if I don't perform, all of these bad things could happen. Or I'm like, yeah, there's pressure on me, but I'm ready for it. It's a challenge. Competition is still going to be a challenge, but I'm able for it because I've put in the work. So there's still going to be pressure on me, but I have the skills and the strategies and I have the ability to cope with that. So yeah, I think pressure is very much just a perception of what your capabilities are. Like they say stress, pressure and stress are kind of under the same umbrella, and stress is just an imbalance between the resource and the demand. So you feel pressure so for example, you're writing an essay, you feel under pressure or stress because you have 10,000 words to write and you have 2 days to write it. That's stress, that's pressure. But if the demands are greater than the resource. So like going into a competition that you don't feel prepared for, or you feel that there's too much expectation that you can't live up to, that's pressure, that's a threat. But if it's something that you feel, okay, maybe I'm not ready for it, it might be a bit above my capabilities, but I know that the outcome, it doesn't mean too much, or I'm not going to put too much meaning on an outcome because there isn't an expectation on me. So it's very much how you perceive that situation, I think, in terms of pressure.
How do you balance, for any coaches listening, how do you balance building a resilient athlete without completely tearing their confidence?
I think you can, absolutely. Resilience is a skill. We're not born with resilience, and resilience is very much just learning from a situation and applying those lessons the next time round. So, I work with athletes who get injured, athletes who have setbacks. All of those are chances to build resilience, seeing that as an opportunity to build my resilience muscle. You talked about this, the muscle, and like talent, resilience can be seen as a muscle, that you flex every time. So, I don't know, Orla, you probably remember the first time you ever got an injury.
Oh, I do remember it well. Yeah, I'm still with it 10 years later.
Yeah, it's probably the worst thing that ever happened. And it might be a minor injury in comparison to maybe further down the career. But the more you have that experience, you learn from that. So I remember my first injury, I tore my hamstring. in the grand scheme of things, wasn't a bad injury. 6 weeks later, I was absolutely fine. But oh my God, I was like, this is the worst thing that could ever happen to anyone. And I was devastated. But then I spent more time getting injured and I learned coping strategies. I understood it better. I became more resilient in the face of that exact setback. And resilience can be applicable to different situations. But it can also, it's a skill that you can apply to others. So you're like, okay, this is a setback. I know I have coping strategies. I know I have people around me that will help me. I've got that social support. I have other things going on. So that resilience is a skill that you learn in response to something that you can then apply. And I think the only way you can learn the resilience or actually develop it is by reflecting on that experience. Okay, well, what is the worst part of this experience? What am I doing about it? How am I kind of dealing with it? What are the skills or what are the strategies I'm putting in place? How can I make this a less challenging experience? So if you're injured, seeing the opportunities that are, they might not seem like there's many, but there's more time. It might be time to spend with family. It might be time to spend on college work or school work. It's an opportunity to work on areas you don't get to work on because you're so busy with your other training, in terms of physical kind of abilities. So then the next time you get injured, you're like, okay, it was terrible. It's a terrible time, but I know what I'm going to do. I know how I'm going to cope with it. So yeah, you don't have to tear down confidence. If anything, resilience and confidence can go hand in hand, and I think the more resilient you are, the more confident you can be in the face of those challenging times.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. You mentioned kind of having time, because the podcast was born out of, I had a big injury, and the injury is now 10 years. It's going on 10 years, but I had big surgery. So that's why I couldn't play. But this is why I set up the podcast, and now I get to connect with the likes of yourself, all these amazing athletes. So there's always an opportunity. I think you had a great quote on the webinar: to hell with circumstances, I create opportunity. And written that down. And it's like, it's really important to remember that, because I think as athletes, we get so caught up in, I'm missing this big match, and I'm missed 3 years of playing, and I'm still in my 20s, so I should be in my prime and all this stuff. But it's an opportunity to do something else. And I always think, like, if I hadn't been injured, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And it's 100%. Mad to think of.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've heard of Imogen Cotter. She's a cyclist. So she's worth a follow on Instagram. I don't know Imogen that well. She used to be an athlete and did the Trans ID program, moved to track cycling, and now is a road cyclist in Belgium. In Girona. Was involved in a huge accident. She's very open about it on her Instagram, and she's really worth a follow. In terms of resilience, was in like potentially life-threatening car accident, was hit by a car when she was out training, broke multiple bones, and she is like the definition of resilience, of like seeing the positive in what could have been, because it was something she realizes, this could have been the end of my life, not just the end of my career. This hasn't turned out not to be a career-ending injury. It's going to be one that she won't be maybe back on the bike this year, but she's kind of seeing this setback as something she can come back from stronger, and she's really seeing the opportunities. And she's also very open that it's not always easy, and the days she's feeling sad, she will share as well. So, resilience doesn't mean that it's positive all the time, but it's like accepting that this is a really difficult situation, but I have the skills to get through it. And how have I got the skills from being in this situation before, for example?
Exactly. We've mentioned how difficult a lot of these topics are and how hard it is for athletes. Why do you enjoy being a sports psychologist? What that sounded a bit weird, but that sounded a bit strange the way I phrased that. Why do you enjoy your job? Why do you love it so much? Because I can see the passion in you giving me all these answers.
Well, you're right, because I've started if you're to count how many times I started with, it's hard. Why are you doing it then if it's so hard? And it's like, because I know I've got a skill set that are helpful in that situation. Like I said, my other half, Paul, he is an orthopedic surgeon. My sister works in finance. They're jobs I could never do. I don't have the right skill set. I know I'm someone who is a good listener. I would have a level of empathy and emotional intelligence. I wouldn't be very good at logic or numbers or the organization. I know that I have a skill set that works in this circumstance. And I'm really lucky that I found a career that not only marries the passions that I have of being involved in sports. I love working with people. I love to help people. I love to see people improve and make the best of what their situation is. So like I said, if that's being the top performer or just improving their confidence, I really enjoy seeing that. And look, I don't get some sort of sick enjoyment out of people having a tough time, but I like to know that I'm someone who can be there and be a comfort in that situation, because I know a lot of athletes, it's a really vulnerable time to open up to a psychologist, to a sports psychologist. I know there is still a stigma around it, and I'm really glad that I can be a person that people can be vulnerable with in a non-judgmental. I'm not someone who knows them personally, so I can be that kind of external, kind of sounding board for people that don't really have someone else to talk to about these things. They may not have people in their life that really get sport, for example. So yeah, I love it, and I love that I have something that I found that's matched kind of the skill set that I kind of have.
Yeah. How do you think you've evolved as a sports psychologist? So if I was one of your clients and I went to you when you originally started up to now, what do you think is the biggest difference between how you approach a client, how you deal with a client, the different methods you use?
I'd say it's night and day. I definitely, probably when I first sat down with an athlete, I didn't know what I was doing. I was like, oh my God, I have all these things and all these theories from books. How do I actually apply it to an athlete? So there's definitely more of a comfort of being in with an athlete, sitting in discomfort, because there's a desire to fix. You might see a fix, but you have to help guide an athlete. I can give strategies and I can give ideas, but you're guiding an athlete to things. You're not always like, and sometimes they want you to tell them stuff, and you do. You give them strategies. They've just said this is how they feel in a certain situation. You give them strategies to cope. But there can be a desire to jump in and fix too quickly. And there has to be time spent getting to know them, getting to know their background, sometimes challenging an athlete, which is something I still find a little bit more uncomfortable. It's still something I do, but challenging an athlete on something, because they are coming from one perspective, challenging to see other perspectives. Maybe they're coming in giving out about a fellow teammate or a coach or a manager or something else, or competitors, kind of challenging and saying, well, have you considered this perspective? Or you considered this side of it? And that can be more uncomfortable because, obviously you are seen as someone, I am a support, but I can't just be there to kind of massage egos either. There has to be, if you want to help someone improve, sometimes it involves challenging them a little bit as well. And that's probably something I didn't do early on. I probably just let people talk and never really challenge and just listen. So I've become better at kind of guiding conversations without telling. And then I suppose, just more comfortable in myself, I definitely didn't feel like I knew what I was doing. I don't think I'll ever feel like I 100% know what I'm doing, but I'm definitely more comfortable that I don't need to be in there, spouting theory, or sometimes it is just a time that you're just needed as a shoulder. You just needed as someone to vent to. You're not needed for an answer today, and knowing what's needed in the moment rather than going to, okay, mental skills training 101, what is needed here? What's the theory, and being comfortable with that. And I remember the first few sessions, I came out wrecked, because you're spending so much time actively listening, and you're probably doing in your podcast all the time that you're like, you're listening, processing, and coming up with a response. Because if an athlete just told you everything, you don't want to be sitting there going, for ages, you're expected to respond at some stage. So a lot of that was a skill in doing that, and getting used to it and being comfortable. But I think it's just something I've become more comfortable myself doing it, and I have more belief that I know what I'm doing, which it's hard because it's not a job that you get that kind of, you're doing a good job. It's very hard. There's no measurables. If an athlete you work with is performing well, it may not be anything to do with what you're doing. You may actually be taking away from their performance. You don't know that. So, it's just kind of growing that belief that I'm doing a good job and what I'm doing is working in some way. So, I have one or two athletes who were some of my very first who are still with me. It'd be an interesting one to ask them.
Yeah,
I want to know the answer though.
That's true. Out of interest then, you mentioned there it's very hard to measure. You're like a pro, because that was literally my next question. How do you measure your success with a client, with an athlete? Like, for example, let's say I was your client and we worked together for a while. How do you see then that your work is impacting me, and how do you measure that?
I suppose there's a few ways. Like, you could say that if someone comes back to you, but then at the same time, if they didn't come back to me, that might not be necessarily a measure of my skills or ability. It could be they got all they needed out of me. So that's not really the only measure. But if they are someone who's coming back, but they're not always asking the same thing, so they've come back for a different reason, then yeah, okay, I'm obviously a support that's valuable to them. If sometimes feedback from external sources like coaches or people who know them, you might get a coach kind of saying, oh, thanks so much. I've definitely seen a difference in how they approach competition. Their routine has definitely been refined, or they definitely didn't have as much of a breakdown after a bad performance as they have before. So sometimes that external feedback can be really valuable. Just a coach kind of saying, thanks for that. I've definitely seen some value in what you've done. An athlete's feedback obviously could be amazing, but I don't look for that. But I've been very lucky that even some of the girls that I work with have been on this podcast and have name checked me, which has been, it's really flattering, and I don't expect it. But when it is, you kind of go, okay, thank God they're actually mentioning my name. I must be doing okay. But I think you just know when an athlete comes away, and you get a sense that they're understanding, and I'm always checking during, do they understand? Does that make sense? I do a lot of checking during conversations, especially early on when I'm getting to know them, if they're taking it on board, if they're kind of getting what I'm talking about. So yeah, it's not really a measurable thing, but the fact that I still have my job, I was brought to Tokyo as part of the team, I assume I'm doing okay in some way. So yeah, you just kind of have to figure out different ways. I've got an amazing support team in the very small psychology team in the institute, and Kate Kirby is my mentor, and she's fantastic. I mean, she is the benchmark for female sports psychologists and sports psychologists in Ireland, and she is a mentor. And if she gives me any kind of positive feedback, I know I'm doing a good job, because she wouldn't tell me. She'd tell me if I wasn't. So I think they're your kind of few measures without having a numerical measure, for example.
Mm-hmm. Out of everyone you've worked with, you've competed against or trained with, what are the common attributes of the most successful athletes? Is there any just common things you've just noticed across a number of different people?
That's a really good question. It's an obvious one, but I suppose they love what they're doing. Not everyone does, actually. No, I take that back. Not everyone loves it. I think everyone is very passionate and driven. I think there's that real passion and drive, especially people that work with me. If they've come to sports psychology, which is still not that new of an industry in Ireland, but it's definitely, of all the other sports sciences, it's definitely the newest for people to turn to, or the last thing people turn to. So people who are coming to see me are really driven. They're leaving no stone unturned. They really want to improve. They want to be the best, or want to be the best for themselves. So that kind of passion, that kind of drive, that commitment. And I think that's not just the athletes, the people I work with. There's such a passion for what they do. There's a drive to be the best version of what they are, whether it's SNC or if it's physio or nutrition. And, that professionalism, that I work with, like the people that I work with are ultimate professionals, and it's athlete first, and I know it's different to being when you're talking about the athletes you work with, but that's what I really notice, is that the athlete is always first with the people I work with, which is fantastic. And then the athletes, I suppose it is that drive, that passion, that desire to be better, because like I said, you don't pay to go to a sports psychologist if you're not really that bothered.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. And for anyone listening, out of interest, is that drive and that motivation only created by the athlete, or can a coach, while not pushing them because they know they love their sport, can they help create that sustainable motivation? And what would you see as sustainable? Because I think sometimes motivation comes in different forms. It's obviously different for every person, but sometimes it might not be the most effective form of motivation.
Yeah, and I suppose, internal motivation, that intrinsic motivation that comes from the athlete is obviously really important. And, I even mentioned that drive and passion, that will look very different in every athlete. And when I say drive and passion, I'm not saying that someone is like, my sport is everything and rah, it doesn't have to be that fire that we would think of when we think of passion. It can be that quiet passion, that kind of, and I've, worked with athletes who I know they're passionate, but they don't show it in the way that would be the typical that you think of. And I think coaches need to understand what motivates their athlete as well. Is it just the pat on the back and saying, well done, acknowledging the hard work? Or is it being like, you have a month until this competition, you need to put everything into your training? And I think, again, like any element of psychology, it's very individual, and it's really about getting to know the athlete. Some people are motivated by positive feedback. Some people are motivated by fear of, the time is ticking. We are going to the biggest competition in a couple of weeks. We need to be ready. So these need to be the best sessions of your life. That will work for one athlete, but it will absolutely not work for another. So I think it's really on the athlete, but the coach can definitely contribute to that motivation, or they can actually, take away from that motivation if they use the wrong strategy with an athlete. Like if it's a very quiet, self-driven, intrinsically motivated athlete, and you're always pushing outcome, 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 it may actually send them the other way and actually do the opposite of what you're intending. And vice versa. If you're someone who wants praise and feedback for your hard work, and all they're doing is going, "Yep, well done, that's great," and not being very enthusiastic, you might lose that athlete as well. So it's really about, and coaches are very good, and the coaches that I work with, they're very good at knowing and understanding their athletes, but it is something to spend time with them, and understanding what works for them, because you can have a really, really good impact on that motivation.
Yeah, everything we've talked about is so individualized, and it's interesting that there's been a lot of kind of, not even, it's just well known. I don't think we even need the research behind it, but there's so much burnout in athletes, particularly kids at underage, that teenage level, where there's so much pressure on them from so many different people, different forms of pressure. How do you balance that burnout and prevent it, and make sure athletes are still enjoying their sport at any age and at any level?
Yeah, well, burnout comes from somewhere. It doesn't happen by chance. So why did it happen? Is it because they're trying to do too much? You only have a pool of resources, a pool of energy that you draw from, no matter whether it's physical or mental. So, or physical or mental, yeah. So like if they're doing their leaving cert, they're trying to, get onto the Irish basketball team, but they're also trying to get onto their senior camogie team, and they're also trying to win national championships in athletics. That energy pool is going to be depleted pretty quickly compared to someone who's just doing their leaving cert and nothing else. So who's the one who's going to burn out more quickly? It's the one who's doing too much. And again, I talked about it, the demands versus the resources. Like, are the demands in line with the resources they have, the time, the energy, the supports they have? And those supports can be like parents that are there to drop them around to places, to wash their gear, to feed them, So, I think it really is to look at what the situation is for a young athlete as well, because there is a lot of demands, and exams are really important. Unfortunately, we can say leaving cert, whatever, but it is important, and there's no point lying about it, because it does have it's not the most important thing in the world, and it doesn't matter if you don't get what you want on the day, but you also can't pretend it's not there. Exams are going to happen whether you study or not. So it is a stressful year, and I work with a lot of leaving cert athletes. So, it's about balancing the demands and the resources and prioritizing appropriately. And, is it fair that the athlete is trying, or even if you take leaving cert out of it, is it fair that you're trying to perform at the highest level across all these different sports? Is that realistic for where you are? Can you actually physically fit in all the training? Or, so I think burnout doesn't just happen, and looking at what is realistic, how much someone is trying to put in a week, and kind of say, well, do you really need to be the top performer in this sport? Can you just do this one more for enjoyment and just do the training when you can and focus on this? Because there has to be a time when, other things have to give way. Like burnout does happen because we essentially just trying to do too much or expecting too much of ourselves, and we don't have the resources to cope.
Something that's come up a lot in the podcast is music. A lot of athletes use music in their pre-game routine or pre-race or anything. And you mentioned on a podcast before, it's interesting. I don't even know if I like it, but it would have been traditional that you put on a bit of dance music, bit of whatever before a game or before a race. But you kind of were saying high tempo music. Now obviously it's individual, but sometimes that can attribute to nerves. And that actually got me thinking, is I've just followed this cliche of it has to be this dance, big high tempo music, but that's actually nearly attributing to me getting kind of a bit shaky, a bit nervous before a big competition.
Yeah, I can. Like, music is very emotional, but also physically respond. We respond physiologically to the beat we're listening to. So, if you're listening to something high tempo, physiologically, you're probably responding to that. Your heart rate might kind of increase a little bit. There might be a bit more adrenaline because you associate dance music with like loads of activity and excitement. And even the example, like you look at Michael Phelps, headphones on, hood up, like beating his chest before he goes out, and that kind of message spread across swimming quite quickly, that that's what I need to be doing to perform. I need to be listening to the Eminem, to the rap, hoodie up, strutting with a bit of swag if I want to perform. And it's not. If you look at it, there's a really famous clip going around from Rio of Chad Leclos and Michael Phelps. We're both in the call room pre-race. I'd recommend you watch it because it's just the contrast of two people. So Chad Leclos, he was a South African swimmer who won a gold. I think he was the only person to beat Michael Phelps, maybe. Yeah. So it was this infamous kind of battle every time and in the call room there was a clip and it was Michael Phelps. It was that meme of Michael Phelps' face, hood up, headphones on, face looking like thunder. And beside him, Chad Leclos dancing around, shaking his arms. You know, he probably was waving to his dad walking out. You know, you don't have to be the very focused dance music, rap music. You know, it's what works for you. And if, you know, I'll always talk to athletes if they have playlists and I kind of say, okay, was it curated? Is it random? If they say, oh, it's random, I'm going, ooh, is that a good idea? You tend to get nervous or you tend to be quite emotional before a race. And what if a song that reminds you of an ex-girlfriend, or what if a song that reminds you of a really bad time or something that makes you really overly nervous comes on? You know, you think of things like, you know, Eminem's Lose Yourself. We all associate that with like perform, yeah. But listen to the lyrics of that the next time. It's like, is that adding to pressure or taking away? You know, you have one opportunity, you have one chance. You don't blow us, essentially. A lot of pressure to be coming in your ears when you're about to go out and perform. So if that works for you and you don't buy into lyrics and you just listen to the beat, brilliant. Like I loved rap music when I was like, I loved that kind of music, but I wasn't listening to lyrics. It was just because I'm not that cool. So I love to think, you know, in my ear, I was cool. I was strutting down the track. I'd say I looked like such a loser and I think about it, but I thought I was very cool. But that's what I wanted. I used to be nearly to the side of being too relaxed before a race. So I needed something for a bit of oomph. But if you're already someone who is quite highly strung before a race or quite nervous, maybe you need something it doesn't even have to be a tempo, but just it could be the songs that put you in a good mood or relax you, or it could be a tempo that's a bit slower to kind of calm everything down. If you are someone who needs to calm down, oh my,
we've been talking for so long. The light is
gone. You're fine. Sure, just don't need to see me. But yeah, so it is interesting that music is something that's overlooked and it's actually really powerful. You know, but it's overlooked so often.
Yeah, that's when I was listening to the webinar, I was like, oh my God, like I've never actually thought about, sometimes I'm listening to this music that isn't going to help me. What do you think is one thing that the general population, or even specifically sports, because general population probably don't even know or even recognise the importance of sports psychology, that you want them to know about elite performance and sports psychology?
So I think there's two things. You're going to learn this. I'm a bit indecisive, so I don't always have the one thing. So when it comes to sideline 7, I won't have the one thing.
That's fair.
But I suppose in terms of sports psychology, the first thing is sports psychology is not sitting on a couch talking about my feelings. And I think this is one of the real misconceptions, is that people are going to come in and they're going to lie on a couch and talk about their feelings and be emotional. It's performance. If you don't want to talk about emotions, that is absolutely fine. If emotions are relative to your performance, when I talk about emotions, that's anger, that's fear, that's nerves, that's aggression. It's not just sadness, which I think people hear emotion, they think of crying. And that's not necessarily it. It can be positive emotions, it can be other emotions. But that's not what sports psychology necessarily is. It's not rocket science. And a lot of people are very surprised when they've, you know, been to a workshop or been to a webinar. They're going, oh, I knew all that. Like, that's what it is. So you see, so I think, yeah, it's not rocket science. No one is going to come and have their mind blown. If anything, they'll have their mind blown and be like, is this seriously what you studied 3 degrees to tell me? Is probably more it. It is very much stuff you probably already know, but it's putting it in a different perspective. It's giving strategies to use the knowledge you probably already have, but are using it wrong or not applying it in the right way to the situation. Like you said, you're using music, but could you be using it better? You know, so very much sports psychology is not rocket science. It's not going to be something you've never thought about. It's a support. It's not the most important support. It's something that is part of a wider team. You know, I'd never try to say sports psychology is more important than any other member of the support team or any less important. We're just part of that multidisciplinary team. So that's kind of what I would try to say, is that to dispel that myth of what sports psychology is. It's not this mystical thing by any means, and it's certainly not lying on a couch crying.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Unless you want to.
Unless you want, yeah, exactly. But it makes a lot of sense because people are so, like, even you were saying, there's still this perception, even though it's not as new as it was. There's still, particularly I think in Ireland, it's I don't need a sports psychologist. Oh my god, that's it. Like,
I don't have anything wrong. Yeah, but it's the same idea of people not wanting to see a physio till they're injured. You know, well, sure, nothing wrong with me. Why do I go to physio? And it's like, yeah, but you could get stronger. You could get better. You could prevent. You know, you can do prehabilitation to prevent an injury. Sports psychology is the same. It's giving you coping strategies so you don't end up in a situation where things are wrong. Hopefully. You know, or you're better able to deal with them when they do go wrong.
Mm-hmm. I think the pandemic was interesting for athletes because the Olympics was obviously postponed, everything was postponed, and then when things did come back, there was no fans. From your perspective, what was the biggest lesson you learned from the pandemic, whether it was within sport or outside of sport?
Yeah, I think it was the biggest lesson that I think athletes learned was, I think they kind of either made them realize how important or unimportant sport is in their life because suddenly it was all taken away. And I think what was not great, but what you definitely saw is that more people turned to sports psychology and to psychological strategies because they realized how important they were in a time where there wasn't anything else that they could do. And they really realized, it was the first time a lot of people maybe had struggled, and had some really kind of, some psychological, not even distress, but like some psychological challenges because they are suddenly the first time they're struggling with motivation. It's the first time they've had a setback and they're not training. They could be athletes who've never been injured, so they've never not been training. So it was a time where a lot of people did turn to psychology, and from a really negative time, it has really opened the doors to a lot of people that maybe hadn't considered it. Even the use of webinars, you've mentioned the webinars and stuff. It's definitely opened the door to it better than anything else could have, is people experiencing setbacks and realizing I actually don't have much coping strategies for something like this happening. Now, none of us have coping strategies for a pandemic, but what the pandemic was a massive setback for people, and especially in sport. It was a huge extended setback, the same way as an injury is. And a lot of people didn't really have any strategies or skills to deal with that. So, that was a lesson for me. And I suppose on a really simple is like, I don't have to be in person with someone to help them. Technology is great, and it's not something I explored, and it's really opened doors that I can support people better. I'm probably supporting people better now than I did previously because, the idea of Skyping me when they're at a competition, it would be text. Everything would have been by text. No one's ringing me. So it's definitely opened up the support structure wider and better. So I have people maybe the morning of a race, if they're racing at 8 o'clock that night, might be giving me a quick FaceTime to be like, oh, can I just check in? I just want to have a few hours to kill, and I know my head's going to go a bit negative. That would never happen before. So, people are seeing psychology for what it is, as a support that's there all the time, rather than it being when things are going wrong.
Out of interest, looking back then to your career, from everything you've learned since you've retired, is there anything you wish you knew at the time when you were still competing?
I wish I would have known. I wish I would have known that my career was going to look very different to what I thought. But then actually what I wish I've known, no, I wouldn't wish I would have known that, but I wish I would have made some better decisions. I tended to jump with 2 feet at opportunities, which were great opportunities. I don't regret them, but I moved to the UK for 2 years, but I didn't give it a huge amount of thought. I was like, oh, brilliant opportunity, let's go. And it didn't work out. And I came back kind of tail between my legs. And while it was a great opportunity, and it was an opportunity to train in a different country, I didn't really think about why I needed to go. It was like, this is a great opportunity, but do I need to leave? And I actually didn't need to leave at the time, probably. Or, there's been decisions I've made, or, I wish I had been better at doing my rehab. I didn't know better than physios. I wish I had done the 6 weeks rather than stopping it at 5, or always kind of trying to rush through to things. I wish I had known to have a bit more patience and to kind of trust the process and listen to people around me better, which is probably why I'm, quite passionate about it now in my role, because I see other athletes doing what I did, and they're pushing on, and maybe looking for other opinions because the one that they're getting is not what they want to hear right now, and rather than sitting with it. So yeah, I don't think I would have wanted to know how my career is going to pan out, because I probably wouldn't have been as motivated throughout, but definitely have known that like some of the decisions that I'm going to make, I need to give more thought to.
Okay, that makes sense. I meant to ask Sophie Becker this question. Sophie, I hope you're listening. Would you have preferred a PB or a medal during your career? What trumps the other? Ideally, you want both, but what would it be for you?
A medal.
Okay.
Yeah, a medal, because everyone knows medalists. PBs are great. Now, if I had ran an incredible PB and made a final as a result, yeah. I wish my PB was a lot faster, and I know it could have been faster, but I also, someone who finishes their career with a European medal or a world medal, that's never taken away from them. And a PB, you might have an Irish record, someone else is going to come break that. And I always wanted the Irish record, but I think a medal is something that you can never have taken. It's physically there, and you will always be so-and-so medalist, and I think it's a really special thing, because it's that real reward for the hard work. PBs are amazing, and I always wanted them, but I think if I had now, I would love to have a medal, because now that's something I can look at. I can't look at a PB when I'm retired.
Good point.
Can't hang that on my wall.
Yeah, that's a great. I never even thought of that. That physical medal is obviously that big thing. Like nobody can never take it away from you. That's a good point.
Ask me when I was an athlete, I would have said a PB. But because I was still driving for it. Whereas now I'm looking at, even over your shoulder, you've got, trophies and stuff. They're physical things glittering. I'm not going to write a PB on my wall. But at the time, it would have been different.
Out of interest, for anybody listening, is there any particular book, podcast, or social media page recommendation that you would give them to kind of, open their mind to, or someone you just find value from?
Yeah, so I know I mentioned him already, but Damien Hughes I find fascinating. I have his book, The Barcelona Way, which I think is great for anyone who's involved in any kind of team, or it doesn't even have to be a team sport, but I think The Barcelona Way is a really interesting look at sports culture and how it's kind of formed and what makes it and what breaks it. I think his podcast is fascinating because it's not just with athletes, and it's just some really interesting people that he interviews. Other podcasts, I'd have to have a think. I usually
apart from this one, obviously.
Apart from this one, obviously.
Yeah.
I think that was too obvious. Yeah, besides that. So you've had some incredible guests. Like when I was actually scrolling back through, because I was like, I'm going to do my homework and listen to a few more. I've only listened to a few. You've had some incredible people.
I'm very lucky. I've connected with some amazing people. So
yeah, it's been amazing. And I think things like that. But then, like, I spend a lot of time listening to sports stuff. But I also love to switch off. And there's a thing called Only the Rich. Like, I'm fascinated by like celebrity stories and scandals. So, like one of them was now it's fluff, but it's interesting. It could be the backstory to Paris Hilton or Madonna or the Murdochs. But I love that. I love kind of knowing stories. So if you're looking for something to switch off your mind, have a bit of time to kill, something like that. But I think Damien Hughes' podcast is, aside from this one, is a great one to have. Just a really interesting people to listen to, and I think he's really interesting because he's so established in my field. So I think he's great.
I'm going to put you on the spot with this one, but could you nominate somebody that I should get on the podcast? And if you do, give me a name. I might need your help getting them on.
Okay. Who will be an interesting interview? That's a really good one. I actually heard you ask people that, and I never thought of it. Come back to me. I'll have a think.
I'll come back to you.
Come back to it at the end.
I will.
I'll be racking my brain.
Final question before I move on to silence. I'm also just really conscious of time. If you need to go, just let me know.
No, good.
Your life has revolved around sport for the last, you said, even 20 years, but even above that, longer than that, because you're now a sports psychologist. But if you weren't an athlete and you weren't involved in sports psychology, what would you do?
I think I'd still be in some sort of caring profession. I think I'd still be in something along the psychology, because it's still my skill set. Even if I take sport out of it, it's something I love doing, is helping people, using that kind of empathetic ear. So probably something in the kind of psychology, social sciences kind of side. Or maybe acting. I don't know. I used to do drama when I was younger, so I always thought
Okay,
I was
yeah.
going to be a thespian.
Brilliant. I
It's
wasn't
something
expecting
I
that.
loved. I loved being on stage. So if I hadn't pursued that, I maybe probably would have pursued more things like drama clubs and stuff in college. But with athletics, there was not much time.
Yeah,
So
that's a good point. That's a good point.
yeah.
I'm going to move on to sideline 7. It's the same 7
Okay.
questions at the end of every episode. Question 1, what is your favourite quote?
I have this ready because I can never remember it exactly. And I had, because I knew what it was, but I could never remember the wording. And I have to get it right because it's Einstein. And I was like, I can't get
Okay.
Einstein's quote wrong. And I'm not being very cerebral and I'm not trying to be like, oh, I have an Einstein quote. But it's one I discovered when I was an athlete. And I really liked it and it really resonated with me. And I don't know if you've heard it. So it's, everybody's a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. You know that one?
Love
You know
that.
what
Yeah, I love
yeah,
that one.
I
That's
love
really
that
clever.
one. I think it's really good because it's something I have probably always fall victim to is comparing and assuming because I'm not as good as someone else that I'm not good. You know, I trained in a really, really talented group of girls as an underage athlete in Ferrybank Athletic Club. And because those girls are all better than me, I was like, well, the Olympics is not going to be for me. You know, that's not my thing, you know. And I did always compare. And it's kind of, I think it's really nice. And it comes back to what I talked about in terms of strengths, that like you might not have the same strengths as everybody else, but you still have strengths. So I think I really like that. I think it really resonated with me.
Brilliant. Question 2, what's the best sporting event you've been to? And you can pick one as being involved or one as a fan, whatever you choose.
So, look, I mean, I can't really skip by the London Olympics, both as a fan and as an athlete. It was just, I'll never experience something like, so I was very fortunate to be at Super Saturday. Like the Super Saturday, I was there for when Jess Ennis, Mo Farah, and Greg Rutherford won their gold medals. Like, there was 80,000 people in the stadium, but if you told me there was a million, I'd have believed you because the noise, the atmosphere. So Mo was running, I think, his 10K that night. And the entire time there's a Mexican wave following him, like the whole time. Like it was incredible. I've never experienced anything like the crowd, anything like the atmosphere. To be a part of that, like even thinking about it, like it's like hair on the back of your neck kind of moment. It was incredible. When Jess Ennis crossed the line in that 800 meters, the place lost it. Like, and you got so caught up in it. We were so into it. So that was just a real moment in time to be part of. And then to be an athlete, to be able to walk into that stadium a few nights later, and we were running at the same time as the GB team. So like we had that noise with us. Now it wasn't for us, but you don't need to know that.
Yeah.
But like that, there's 80,000 people, and you're walking out and you're going, oh my God, that crowd that I was part of is now cheering for us, kind of. So, you know, that was just an incredible thing to be part of. And, you know, the whole games was incredible. It really was a standout game. People who've been to a few have said London really did stand out. It was so well organized. I got to see the Spice Girls at the closing ceremony. I mean,
that's the highlight. Yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Brilliant. I think you had a race, was it in 2013? Torrential rain in the 8th lane?
God, yes, 2013, the World Student Games. That was memorable for all different reasons. But that was that was a real sign of resilience for me. And I remember I used to work for Sky Sports, and we used to have to talk about resilience with athletes and kind of show examples of it. And I used to use my race, and I was like, okay, this is very full of myself. But I was like, I remember, like, you see the video, and it was like the worst rain. I remember actually saying to it was thunder and lightning as well starting. I remember actually talking to one of the officials when the rain started, being like, "This is dangerous." And they said,
because the hurdles when you're trying to jump,
it was slippery. It was like it was the kind of rain you can't see in front of you. And I was like, "This is dangerous." And they said, "You're on the track. You have to proceed. We have to run the race." Like the next race got delayed, and I remember I was like, I had two choices. Could give in to the rain and be like, "This is crap," or it was a semi-final. I had the top two to qualify for the final. And I knew I wasn't going to run fast time at that time, so I had to be in top two. And I could make the decision to just give in to the rain, which a lot of girls did. I was in the outside lane, so I couldn't see, which probably helped. But you could see in the video on YouTube of all the girls like clinging, you know, holding themselves and like hugging their arms and shivering. And I was like, I had them beaten already. I just didn't know it because they had already given into the rain and the cold. It was cold. And I just made the decision. I was like, I'm just going to do what I can in this rain. There's nothing I can do about it. We're all in the same position. And it was and I ended up just missing out on winning it. I got into the semi-final or into the final. I came second, nearly won the race. without knowing. Like I was winning it up until the
Yeah,
last 100
I
meters.
saw the clip. Yeah.
I was like, oh
You
my
come
God,
out of
I was doing
nowhere.
well there. But it was just, I just made that decision, and it was really resilient because I could easily, that couple of years ago, I would have crumbled. I would have been like, this is awful. I'm so cold. I can't run in this rain. And I just made the decision. I was like, I'm just going to do it. It's the only thing I can do. So yeah, that was definitely memorable for a different reason. Made some great photos though. My Instagram photo for that is great.
That's true. Another great Instagram photo. You brought a hurdle to Leinster House. Can you explain that one?
You've done your homework. Yeah, I have no shame. But I think about that day, it's so funny. So I was given a postgraduate grant for my PhD. So it's called the Irish Research Council. And they asked, there could be a couple of hundred that are given every year, but I was chosen as one of the people to come up for a photo shoot. And they were like, oh, and bring a prop. So like there's a guy brought a test tube, someone else brought a book or something. And I was like, what the hell is a prop for athlete mental health? And I was like, well, I'm a hurdler and I'm talking about the barriers to help seeking and mental health. Let's bring a physical barrier. And I don't know if I didn't have the car, or I think because it was in the city centre and I was coming straight back down, I was like, it makes no sense to drive. So I got the train with a hurdle. And I brought my hurdle. It was in Marks and Spencer's in the train station while I got a snack. It was I booked on a bike and put my hurdle in where the bike rack was. And I brought the hurdle to Leinster House. So there's a picture of it on the red carpet in Leinster House. And there was pictures of me hurdling it outside Leinster House with a TD. So there you go.
There you go.
Yeah,
big achievement. Question 3. What's been the biggest setback or challenge so far in your career, and how did you react to it?
Without a doubt, it was not qualifying for Rio. Like my whole world, I think, fell apart for a couple of months, and that didn't happen. And I knew it would, but I think I kind of just didn't think about what would happen when it didn't. When I qualified for London as part of the relay, and I missed out on the hurdles. And I remember when that happened, and I got there kind of for the relay, is nearly like a silver lining. And I remember saying, when I'm in Rio, like at the closing ceremony for the London Olympics, there's a handover to the next games. And I was like, I can't wait to be at this ceremony in Rio. There was never a doubt in my mind for 4 years, I'm going to be on that plane to Rio, and Thomas is going to be there, and my family are going to come, and how amazing this is going to be when it happens. It was never it. And every decision I made for 4 years, day in, day out, was all to do with Rio and to get to Rio. And obviously that didn't happen. I picked up quite a few injuries, and it just didn't happen for me. And look, if I had been healthy, I know it could have happened, because there was a training camp in 2015 where I was in serious shape and just came home and picked up an injury and just never really got to show it. So that was really, really hard. That was the biggest setback. And it definitely changed the trajectory of my career afterwards. I found it really hard to refocus for another games after that. And it probably was what led to a kind of a gradual transition into retirement, but it took until 2018 before I really decided I'm done. So that was probably the biggest setback. It was the biggest challenge mentally for me. It was something that took me a long, long time to get over. And I have some really great people around me, and they, everyone was such amazing support. My poor fiance, Paul, we were not long going out when I didn't get to Rio. And I was crying about athletics so much that year when we first, after we started going out, and I was like, I swear athletics makes me happy. It just doesn't show it. I swear I was good at this at one stage. I swear I wasn't always injured, but yeah, it was definitely, that was the biggest setback. And unfortunately, that was sport. Like I said, you can set a goal and it doesn't always happen, and it's hard, but you can get over it. And I did get over it, but it took me a long time.
Mm-hmm. Kind of on the flip side then, what's your biggest achievement on or off the track?
I found that one way harder. I found this one harder. And I remember Damien Hughes said the same. I was like, thank God someone else finds this hard. And again, not because I don't feel like I have, okay, I've been to the Olympics, but I don't feel like that was a standout achievement, because it was kind of the trajectory of where I was going. It wasn't something that I feel like I had to do an extra amount of work to get, if you know what I mean. I think if you talk to me in a few months when this PhD is done, I actually think that's going to be a bigger achievement than the Olympics, because it's been such a mountain for me to climb, because it's the first time I've really, really been challenged. Like in college, I always found it hard. I found hard to a point, but I never had to really push myself. I was quite naturally quite smart. I could put in enough work to get by and do quite well. This has been the first time where just doing enough is not getting me by. So I'm really having to work hard. So this will probably be the biggest achievement. And I think having the job that I have, because it didn't come just off talent. It actually, I had to work for it. I had to work hard and I suppose to be brought to the Olympics in Tokyo as part of the staff. You have to prove yourself and you have to be good at what you do. So I think that was a pretty good achievement for me, pretty big achievement to be part of that. So
looking back to 18-year-old self in secondary school, moving into college, what advice would you give yourself?
I always thought it was going to be have more belief and confidence, but I had a belief and confidence. I think I just didn't use it. Like, I think I was someone who had a lot of potential and always did enough. And it's probably why I'm still doing a PhD nearly 7 years later, because just enough doesn't get you by and everything. But I obviously worked very, very hard, but I know I could have done more. And I think at 18, I didn't have enough. I lived in the moment, which I think was really, really good. It's not great to always live in the future, but I probably didn't look into the future enough. I never believed the Olympics was for me. And then in 2011, suddenly I was like, oh, maybe I will go to the Olympics. So it was all kind of, I was never planning really long term until, like I said, I did in Rio and I changed everything. But at 18, I was just going with it, and I enjoyed it, and I loved my college life, probably too much, as you can imagine. 3 nights out a week isn't conducive to training, believe me. But I wish I had put more thought into my decision making and not always just go with the flow and just go with it and not be influenced by what everyone else is doing and be like, well, what do I want? And have the confidence maybe there to kind of say, well, actually, do I actually want to be an athlete? I've been doing this for this long and I'm still just doing it. What do I want out of it? And I never really kind of had those conversations myself, or had the confidence to kind of really set some targets and set some big goals for myself. So I think, having more confidence in that way. Not that I was a shy retiring 18-year-old, but it was more that I didn't have the confidence to really believe that I was capable of something kind of big.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Dead or alive, who would be your dream dinner guest and why? And you can open up the table to a few people.
Yeah, because I asked you is dead or alive. So I'm glad you changed it, because I really struggled with this one. And look, I could give the really sentimental answer first. If I was to have a dinner party, one of them would be with my granddad. He died when I was 10 and I was like apple of his eye. I was his first grandchild, spoiled, rotten. But I don't think he thought I was very talented. I think I wasn't that great at sports, was grand at school. I would love for him to see what I made of myself, because he was really, really proud, and he was very musical. Becky, my youngest sister, was the one who had musical talent. She was the one who was going to do this. And, I was just the spoiled eldest, but that I just liked watching telly in his house and being spoiled. So I'd love for him to see that, what I've achieved. But I suppose to have a really, celebrity filled one. Me and Paul, my fiance, were talking about this last night. And, like I said, I love stories and I love celebrity. I'm fascinated by celebrity and gossip and all that kind of stuff. And I know I'm studying a PhD and I should be have better interest in that, but I just love it. And so I would love Oprah.
Okay.
Because she has met everybody. She knows everybody. I'd say she has amazing stories. And I think there's a reason why she has this worldwide respect. You don't hear people don't really think much of Oprah. She is universally respected. So I think she would have fascinating stories. I would love Princess Diana, which I know is very random, but I just feel she is fascinating stories. I loved The Crown. That podcast I was saying, Only the Rich, one of their first ones was about Princess Diana. And I just find her and her whole life and her whole story fascinating. I'd love to know more about her and the inner workings of the royal family, because I find that so fascinating. And then we were like, who else? We were saying Mick Jagger. There's a man who has stories. I know it's so random. I know. I'm like, what age are you? But I just feel, again, it's someone who has, you want to be at a dinner party to be entertained. I want people to tell me really interesting stories. Obviously, athletes are interesting, but I work with them day in, day out. I want to hear about stuff I've never going to experience.
Love it.
I want to hear about what it was like in the 60s, before social media existed, what their lives were like. And then a comedian. Aisling Bea, I was kind of thinking someone like Aisling Bea or Joanne McNally. I think you'd have fascinating stories. It would be fun and have someone amazing to cook it as well. I just think, that would be my dinner party. Do you want to come, Orla?
Absolutely. Oh my God, that's a brilliant dinner party. I haven't had such a varied guest for it.
No.
Oprah's actually come up a good few times.
Has she?
That's really interesting. Yeah. But that's a really good answer, and that's lovely about your granddad as well. That's really nice.
Yeah. I don't know if he'd be at the same seat. I don't think he'd be. Maybe I'll be a separate one.
Final question before I let you go. We're going on so long here, so thank you so much for staying on. If your life was a book, what chapter would this be called?
So again, me and Paul were talking about this last night, and he had a very funny answer. His would be Purgatory. We're getting married in November. It's very funny. That would not be mine, though.
No, yeah.
I'm excited to get married. So no, I think for me, and I was trying to think of like a succinct answer. People have had brilliant ones, and I feel like I'm not just moving in. You know, when sometimes books are divided into not just chapters, but like there's like big sections. There's like section 1, chapters, many chapters. I feel like I'm moving into a whole new section. So maybe it's like life doesn't end after 30, or life after 30, because I retired around 30. I'm now very much moved on to a new identity from being Jessie the athlete to Jessie the sports psychologist. I'm really glad, because it was something I was actually trying to do, was not just be this former athlete all the time. So, and I'm going to be a Mrs. now. I'm probably keeping my surname. Sorry, Paul. We'll talk about that when we don't know. We're still just debating whether the name will be dropped or not. But professionally, I'll still be Jessie, but I'm going to be a wife. So my identity is going to shift quite a lot. So I suppose it's kind of, call it shaping a new identity. Jessie in her 30s, whatever. I don't know. Something like that. I need to think of a much more exciting name than that. But I feel like it's not just a chapter. It's a very big section of my life is kind of starting now.
Yeah, I love that answer. And it's interesting you say section, because I recently spoke with Noelle Healy, and she played football for Dublin, and she's a doctor. And I said, what's the chapter? And she kind of joking said the end, because sure, that's it. Like, it's no, she didn't mean it that way, but she kind of meant like it's kind of boring now. Who wants to listen? It's the same thing day in and day out. But I like the way you say section, because it's a different phase of your life. And that's just a really that's a really nice answer.
You know what? And I think I actually listened to Noelle, and I remember hearing her say that, and it is such a, you see that with athletes kind of talking about retiring being the end, and like there is quotes to say that an athlete dies twice, and the first time is when they retire. And I really don't believe that. Like, I really am excited about what this next section of my life, because actually being an athlete essentially was quite boring. Like if you were just like, I see all these takeovers, and I was like, my God, my day was so boring. You're just watching me nap and just eat and watching telly, waiting for the next training session. It was actually quite boring, other than the sprinkling of exciting bit of travel. So, I have much more variety. My days are still boring, but there's more variety. I do more different things. So yeah, I think life doesn't end after being an athlete. And Thomas always said it. He's turning 30 this year, and he always said, oh, she's only 2 good years left when I was 28, 1 good year left at 29. So plenty more good years left, something like that. Or it could just be, is she still doing that PhD?
I'll text you now in 2 years, be like, is that done yet?
Oh, no, yeah. So yeah, no, call it like, the next section, the next life begins with 30, or
brilliant.
Something like that.
Brilliant. Jessie, this was amazing. I absolutely love this. I got notes from it. I have a big page of notes here beside me. Thanks so much for coming on.
You're more than welcome.
Very best of luck with the PhD, with everything. And I can't wait to keep in touch.
Oh, thank you. Definitely keep in touch.
A massive thank you to Jessie for joining me on the podcast today. As I previously mentioned, this is one of my favourite interviews to date, so I personally took a lot away from the chat. I'll be sure to leave all of our social media links in the description box below. If you are enjoying the podcast, I'd really appreciate if you could leave a rating and a review over on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, as it does help the show grow. Massive thank you to Accredited for sponsoring this episode, and thank you for listening.